Hey everyone, and welcome back. You know those recent controversies surrounding Ranveer Allahabadia and Samay Raina?
Yeah, quite a stir in the media.
Well, it's got us thinking it's high time for a deep dive into obscenity laws in India. Super relevant for all you UPSC aspirants out there, especially for mains, but could pop up in prelims too, you never know.
Definitely a hot topic and a complex one.
For sure. We'll be using some recent articles from the Indian Express and Times of India as our springboard.
Sounds good. Always good to have solid references.
Absolutely. So what we're aiming for today? Well, we're going to break down what exactly constitutes obscenity under Indian law. It's not always as straightforward as it seems.
Definitely not.
Then we'll trace how the court's interpretation of obscenity has evolved over time.
Yes. The law is a living thing, always changing.
Precisely. And finally, we'll tackle the implications for content creators in this crazy digital age. It's a whole new ballgame now with social media and all.
For sure. The internet has really blurred the lines.
So let's kick things off with the basics. Which sections of the law are we dealing with here when we talk about obscenity?
The key players are Section 294, the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, we call it the BNS for short, and Section 67 of the Information Technology Act.
The IT Act, right. So one for offline and one for online, essentially.
You got it.
Okay. So how do these sections actually define what's obscene? I mean, it can't just be anything someone finds offensive, right?
You're right. It goes beyond just being offensive. The law gets pretty specific. For something to be considered obscene, it has to be lascivious.
Lascivious.
It has
Right.
to excessively focus on sexuality, and it has to have the potential to corrupt those who view it. So there's a real legal threshold there.
Got it. So it's not just about being shocking or edgy.
Yeah.
It has to meet these specific criteria.
Exactly.
Okay. And what about the penalties for violating these sections? Are they the same, whether it's online or offline?
Good question. Under Section 294 of the BNS, if it's your first offense, you're looking at imprisonment up to 2 years and a fine that can go up to 5,000 time.
Okay. Not exactly a slap on the wrist.
No, but now if we jump to the online world and Section 67 of the IT Act, things get a bit more serious.
Oh, how so?
Well, you could be facing up to 3 years in jail and a fine that could reach 5 lakh.
Wow, okay. So it's treated much more severely in the digital space.
Seems that way, doesn't it?
It does. Now, I'm assuming these laws haven't always been interpreted the same way.
Spot on. The interpretation of obscenity has definitely gone through some major shifts over the years. In the early days, judgments often relied heavily on something called the Hicklin test.
The Hicklin test. Now, that rings a bell. Wasn't that from, like, way back in the day?
Or was 19th century England, to be precise.
Okay, so pretty old school. What was the logic behind it?
Okay, so picture this. The test basically said that if any part of a work could deprave and corrupt even the most sensitive person, the entire work was considered obscene.
Wow, that's harsh.
It was. They were even thinking about, like, a child being influenced by the material. That was the benchmark.
So super strict. So, like, a single sentence in a whole book could get the whole thing banned.
Exactly. Very restrictive.
Were there any famous cases in India that used this test?
Oh, there's a classic one. Ranjit D. Deshi v. State of Maharashtra back in 1964.
Right, right. The banning of Lady Chatterley's lover. Didn't that cause a huge controversy?
Huge. But it shows you how even a literary work could get caught in the net of the Hicklin test.
Wild. So what happened? Did the UK and the US stick with this test forever?
Not at all. They both moved on, thankfully. They realized they needed a more nuanced approach.
I can imagine. Societal values were changing. Ideas about art were evolving.
Exactly. So the UK, with their Obscene Publications Act in 1959, they shifted away from judging isolated bits and started looking at the work as a whole.
Makes sense.
And then the US, they adopted what's called the Community Standards Test.
Oh, yeah. Community standards. I've heard of that.
So instead of that hypothetical most sensitive person, it became about what an average person in that community would consider acceptable.
Right, so it brings in context, which is much more realistic.
But of course, that also makes it more complex to figure out.
Definitely. So how did India catch up to all of this? Did we ditch the Hicklin test eventually?
We did. Big moment for you UPSC folks to remember. The turning point was the 2014 case of Avik Sarkar v. State of West Bengal.
Ah, yes. The Boris Becker case.
That's the one. A nude photograph of him and his fiancée was published, caused quite the uproar.
I can imagine. And what did the Supreme Court say?
They rejected the Hicklin test outright. They said, nope, we're going with a context-based approach. Obscenity, they argued, should be judged based on contemporary community standards, not some imaginary, overly sensitive person.
Okay, so they were like, let's be real about this.
Yeah,
And what about the photograph? Did they consider it obscene?
they did not. It was a big step towards a more, modern understanding of obscenity in India.
And for our listeners prepping for UPSC, it shows how legal principles evolve. It's not static. Social values matter.
Absolutely. And that kind of analysis, understanding how a law has changed over time and why that's gold for the mains exam.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've gone from the super strict Hicklin test to this more context-aware community standards approach. But how does that even work in the digital age? Content is constantly changing. What's acceptable online can shift overnight.
You're telling me. That's where things get really interesting.
I bet.
But you know what? I think we should take a quick break to hear from our sponsors, let everyone catch their breath.
Sounds good to me. And don't forget, folks, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave us your questions in the comments. We'll be back in a flash to tackle obscenity in the digital age. Okay, so we're back and ready to dive into this whole digital world and how obscenity laws play out online. It's a whole different beast, isn't it?
It really is. The internet throws a whole new wrench into things.
I mean, how do you even begin to define community standards online? You've got such a diverse global audience.
You've got people from all walks of life, different cultures, different values. It's a real challenge.
Absolutely. It's not like a small town where everyone kind of agrees on what's acceptable and what's not.
Right. A recent case that really highlights this complexity is the Supreme Court's ruling on that YouTube web series, College Romance. Remember that one?
Oh, yeah, College Romance. That was a pretty popular show, wasn't it? I remember there was some controversy surrounding it.
Yeah, the creators actually faced obscenity charges under Section 292 of the IPC and Section 67 of the IT Act.
Wow, serious stuff. What was it about the show that caused all that?
Well, there was some, let's say, profane language and some pretty frank discussions about sex among college students. Push some buttons, for sure.
So was it actually considered obscene under the law? What did the court ultimately decide?
This is where it gets interesting. The court actually ended up quashing the charges.
Really? So they didn't find it to be obscene?
Nope. They made a really important distinction between obscenity and mere indecency.
Okay, so there's a difference there.
A big one. The judges said that to be considered obscene, the material has to specifically evoke sexual, lustful thoughts.
Ah, I see. So just because a show talks about sex or uses strong language, that doesn't automatically make it legally obscene.
Exactly. Context matters, right?
It does.
So the court looked at College Romance as a whole and said, okay, the language is sometimes sexual, but it's not meant to arouse viewers sexually.
It was more about portraying how young adults actually talk, right?
Right. The excitement, the frustration, even the anger. It's all part of how they communicate.
It seems like the court is really trying to adapt this whole community standards test to the digital world. But how do they even do that? The online world is so vast.
It is a massive puzzle. They're still working it out, to be honest.
I can imagine.
Figuring out how to consider the platform, the specific audience, the norms within these online communities, it's a moving target, really. No easy answers.
All right, well, let's bring this all back to the Ranveer Allahabadia controversy then. Can you give us a quick rundown of the charges against him, Samay Raina, and Apurva Makhija?
Sure. They're facing multiple charges under the BNS, sections 79, 196, 296, and 35. It's a bit of a mouthful.
It is. Can you break that down for us?
Okay, so Section 79 deals with insulting the modesty of a woman. Section 196 is about promoting enmity between different groups, based on religion or other factors. Section 296 covers obscene acts performed in public. And then 35 basically says if multiple people are involved in carrying out an offense, they're all on the hook.
Got it. And to refresh everyone's memory, this all stems from their YouTube show, India's Got Latent, right?
That's right.
What exactly did they say on the show that sparked all of this?
Well, there were certain comments, particularly by Ranveer Allahabadia, that some people found pretty offensive.
Offensive how?
They were seen as demeaning to the Indian family system and offensive to religious sentiments. Plus, there were segments where they were asking about sex and parents in a way that a lot of viewers found inappropriate. It definitely ignited a firestorm.
So the big question here is, did they cross that line from being potentially offensive to actually being legally obscene?
Exactly. And as we've been talking about, that line can get pretty blurry, especially in the digital world.
Definitely. Things are constantly evolving. So what are some of the legal arguments that might come up as this case plays out?
Well, the defense might argue that they were just trying to be funny,
Right. Comedy, satire.
Exactly. That their intent wasn't to be obscene, but to provoke some discussion or just entertain. They could also point to those evolving community standards online. What's offensive to some might be perfectly acceptable, even humorous to others.
So essentially, they could claim it's protected under the right to free speech, artistic expression. But what about the other side? What would the prosecution say?
Well, the prosecution would likely counter that while free speech is important, it's not absolute.
Right, there are limits.
Right. They could argue that the content went too far, even within the context of online comedy, that it did meet that legal definition of obscenity by appealing to prurient interests. They might also focus on the potential harm to younger viewers.
That's a valid point.
Kids who might be influenced by this kind of material.
So you have this clash between the right to free speech and the need to protect societal values, especially when it comes to younger, more impressionable audiences.
Exactly. It's a classic dilemma, and this case is right at the heart of it.
It's definitely a fascinating case with a lot of implications. And for our UPSC folks, it's a goldmine of relevant themes.
Oh, absolutely. Freedom of speech, societal norms, the impact of technology, regulating online content. It's all there.
A perfect example of how current events can connect directly to your exam prep.
Couldn't agree more.
And speaking of the exam, what kind of essay topics could emerge from all of this?
Oh, so many possibilities. You could see questions about the limits of free speech online, the role of the judiciary, the challenges of applying traditional laws to these new digital platforms.
Those are all great points.
Plus, don't forget about prelims. Knowing the specific legal sections we talked about, Section 294, Section 67, that's essential.
So it's not just about memorizing facts and figures, it's about understanding these concepts and applying them to real-world situations.
That's what UPSC is all about, right?
Exactly. But this case isn't just some theoretical debate. It has real consequences for people who create and share content online.
Oh, for sure. Content creators are definitely watching this case closely.
So what are some key takeaways for them? What lessons can they learn from all of this?
Well, first off, it's a reminder that the legal landscape around obscenity is constantly shifting, especially online. What might have been fine a few years ago could be a big no-no today, so content creators need to stay informed.
Be aware of the potential risks.
Exactly. Don't just assume that because you think it's okay, it is.
And second,
Context is absolutely crucial. We've said it before, but it's worth repeating.
I agree, it's key.
Think about the platform you're using, who your target audience is, the message you're trying to get across.
So what flies in a stand-up routine at a comedy club might not be appropriate for a YouTube video aimed at a general audience.
Precisely. And lastly, content creators need to be prepared for backlash. Even if they think they're doing everything by the book, public opinion can be a powerful force.
Like we saw with Ranveer Allahabadia.
Right. Even if there are no legal consequences, there can still be damage to your reputation, your career.
It's a tricky landscape to navigate. You've got to be aware of the legal risks, be mindful of context, and be prepared for potential backlash.
It's a lot to juggle, but that's the reality of being a content creator these days.
Well said. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, but there's still so much more to unpack. Stay tuned as we wrap up this deep dive with some final thoughts on obscenity, the digital age, and what it all means for you, our awesome listeners. All right, we're back for the final stretch of our deep dive into obscenity laws in India. From that super strict Hicklin test to the more modern community standards approach, we've covered a lot of ground. Plus, we've seen how all of this plays out in the digital world, using that Ranveer Allahabadia case as a, well, pretty fascinating example, I'd say.
Definitely fascinating. And as we've seen, it's a tricky thing to balance, isn't it? Freedom of expression on one hand, protecting societal values on the other. And the online world just amplifies all of that.
It does. Content can spread like wildfire online, reaching a global audience in seconds.
It's mind-boggling when you think about it.
It is. But hey, for all you UPSC aspirants tuning in, this is all gold for your exam prep.
Oh, absolutely. Understanding these obscenity laws, how they're interpreted, how they impact content creators online, this is crucial stuff for those man's essays, even for some tricky prelims questions.
So as we wrap up, any final words of wisdom for our listeners who are on that UPSC journey?
Well, the first thing to remember is that legal precedents, they're constantly evolving. Don't just rely on those old textbooks.
Stay updated.
Exactly. Read those recent judgments, those landmark cases, keep up with the debates.
It's dynamic, it's changing, you got to be in the loop.
Right. And second, we've said it a few times already, but context is key.
Context is king.
When you're analyzing any case related to obscenity, think about the platform, think about the audience, think about the message. That kind of nuanced thinking is what UPSC examiners love to see.
It can make or break your analysis.
It can. And finally, this conversation, it's not over. Technology's pushing boundaries all the time. It's forcing us to rethink how we define and regulate obscenity.
And for those of you who are aiming for a career in the civil services, you'll be right in the thick of it.
You will. It's challenging, it's complex, but that's what makes it so rewarding.
Couldn't agree more. Well, folks, before we sign off, just a quick reminder that we based our discussion today on excerpts from the Indian Express and Times of India.
Always a good idea to go back to the source, read those full articles, and form your own opinions.
Absolutely. And if you found this deep dive helpful, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more UPSC-focused content. We're here to support you every step of the way.
We are. And don't be shy. Drop your questions, your thoughts, even your own analysis of these cases down in the comments.
We love hearing from you. Let's keep the conversation going. Until next time, happy studying and best of luck with your UPSC prep.